Thank you very much, Catherine, and welcome everyone to this hour-long webinar, which is part of the Freedom to Speak Up month range of events that we're very proud at MIP to be partnering with the National Guardian Office on. I will say a sort of few startup words in a moment, but just to remind you, this is a recorded webinar, so be mindful of that as you make your contributions. The chat bar, however, won't be reproduced on YouTube, so you won't need to worry about that. And I really encourage you throughout the session, as questions or points, they don't have to be questions, occur to you, please put them in to the chat bar, and I will do my level best to bring as many of those points of view into the conversation as we go. So without further ado, I just wanted to introduce my two co-conspirators. First up is Megan Reitz, who is the author of the book Speak Up, Say What Needs to Be Said, and is a leading researcher the whole sphere of raising concerns in the workplace. So really looking forward to hearing what she's got to say in a few moments. And then David Cain, who is a former NHS chief executive, a former Freedom to Speak Up Guardian in Manchester, and also currently the MIP chair, who I'll be inviting to offer us some reflections on both roles after Megan has finished presenting. So what I hope to do is have Megan speak for about 20 minutes or so, giving us her sort of pearls of wisdom, and then David maybe 10 minutes or so, and then I will bring us all together for a conversation, and by then I hope to have had lots of points and questions from you in the chat. Before I bring Megan in, I just wanted to say a few words, I think, about where I think we've got to on the whole agenda of freedom to speak up, raising concerns. And I think certainly since Robert Francis and others really got the ball rolling, things have moved in different ways over certainly the last 5 years, but over a period of time since mid-staffs and the general concerns that were raised around whistleblowing in the NHS in the early part of the decade. And it feels to me that although there are still masses of problems associated with whistleblowing in particular, the narrative, certainly in management circles, has moved away from it being purely conceived as a problem that needs managing to being an important part of a healthy culture, and that increasingly raising concerns is seen more as a gift for managers worrying about maintaining quality than it is a problem that needs to be solved and unfortunately in some cases avoided, as we know from all too many cases. So I think there is a more positive narrative around raising concerns to the one that we might have had, say, 10 years ago. I think another important change for me, or a trend towards an important change, is that we're seeing this issue less as something for individuals to use process to take forward, and more as something about the whole culture of an organisation and the way the organisation wants to do business. So that move from the lone battler against vested interests towards a whole culture where everyone has an interest and a desire to see concerns raised, I think is becoming part, I'm not saying we're there yet, but becoming part of a new narrative. And I think within that, my third point is I think managers are increasingly seen as an important part of the listening up, raising concerns process. So you can be encouraged to raise your concerns. How your manager deals with that is going to be an absolute critical part of both your experience, but also whether the organisational response is the right one, that your gift of information is used properly for the interests of patients and other staff. So I think the whole agenda around management skill and management mindset is very central now to the raising concerns culture. and it is one that, as a union for managers, we obviously want to campaign for and prioritise, which is why we're working so closely with the National Guardian's Office on the whole issue of listening up. And we'll talk a little bit later about the training that is available to managers through the NGO. So there's starter thoughts. If you object to them strongly, then you know where to put them. They're in the chat box. But can I hand over now to Megan for a presentation on her research and thoughts for us.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's lovely to be with you. Lovely to be with you in a very important month, the Speak Up month, and even more so because this is really focusing in on listening up. So some of you on the call might be quite familiar with some of my work, particularly the Guardians amongst you. But you'll know perhaps that I study what I call conversational habits. So we have habits, we all have habits around when we speak up and when we stay silent. And we also have habits around when we listen and who we listen to. And those habits that we have individually, and then those habits that we have in teams and then in our organizations, you know, have huge consequences, as you know. They can cost organizations their reputations. They can cost us our relationships and our careers. In the NHS, they cost lives, and we're all very aware of that. So I've been examining why we do what we do. Why do we have those conversational habits? And of course, how can we disrupt them? Sometimes the habits are really good, I hasten to add, so we don't want to disrupt everything. But sometimes when the habits are not working well, how can we understand them and disrupt them? And that's what I explore. And I very often mention right at the beginning, a time which was 8 years ago when I first started this particular project called Speaking Truth to Power. I went into an organisation, the first organisation I studied in depth, and I was called in because the leadership team had a problem with the people over there who didn't speak up. And having written a book called Speak Up, they thought I could go and sort of make them speak up. And when I talked to them, probably the most profound comment I've had in my 8 years met me. And they over there said, you know, last time somebody spoke up, they disappeared. And right from word go, I realized, okay, the speaking up, of course, is dependent on how we listen up. It depends on the kind of culture that we can create. I might refer to this later, but I think it was last week, I wrote a blog called How You Show Up Affects My Voice. So how we as managers, if I'm a manager, how I show up in my manager role affects others' voices. So it isn't a matter of trying to fix the individuals that are silent. We can definitely help them and support them, and there's a role for training, but how do we show up? How we show up affects their voice. So I just want to focus in, you know, I've got kind of 8 years of research, and I've got now about 15 minutes to share it with you. So I'm going to focus in on a couple of things, some of which you may have come across before, hopefully a couple of new bits, particularly for the Guardians out there. So, you know, one other thing that I'm noticing as a trend, by the way, which I've been investigating particularly over the last year and a half, is again, we've got leaders saying some, you know, really great things, making some invitations in healthcare, but across all industries. You know, speaking up is a thing. I know so many organizations with speak up campaigns, and we've got leaders saying, you know, bring your whole selves to work. Your opinion counts, speak up. And then I must admit, I've got a slightly wry smile when what happens is that some employees at the moment are kind of going, oh, that's nice. Okay, let's talk about Black Lives Matter. Should we talk about, executive pay levels? I'd really like to talk about that. And I've got a few leaders at the moment that are kind of going, oh, oh no, I didn't mean that bit of yourself. I didn't want you to bring that bit of yourself to work. I just really wanted that bit. And of course it doesn't work like that. So also what I've been looking at is when we invite people to speak up, are we ready to have some conversations that we might not have had in the past? Are we ready to engage in a conversation where we don't know? As managers, we don't know the answer. We're not sure of our ground and our territory. And that's unusual for managers. So how do we help managers be in that place where they can listen up, especially if the topic is one that they're not very used to? So I'll say a bit more about that in just a second as well. So two things I want to bring up and just start the discussion rolling. There's two really good reasons why managers, anybody actually in positions of perceived power, whether they're hierarchical or not, two good reasons that contribute to people not speaking up. They contribute to managers not realizing that they need to do more work to help others to speak up. And they're called, advantage, blindness, and superiority illusion. Let me just speak about them very briefly. Advantage, blindness first. So I talk a lot about the titles and labels that we apply to one another. And you'll be applying them to me right now. So you're applying labels like female, British, white, professor, age, appearance, all sorts of labels you're busy applying to me. You may not realize that, but you will be. If I could see you, I'd be applying them to you too. And these labels and titles convey relative levels of status and authority, depending on the context. And it differs by different sorts of organizations. It differs culturally. But status and authority, and our relative status and authority, is one of the core things that affects whether we speak up and whether we listen up. And again, a big mistake is when organizations and leadership management teams attempt to change the culture of speaking up without talking about power. So there's invitations that go out, to speak up, and we try and change the culture. But unless we alter the way that we construct status and authority in our systems, changing speak up culture will be a really, really tricky thing to do. So kind of a question to pose for you is, what are the labels and titles that affect voice in your teams and your organizations? Obviously the hierarchy one, and my God, NHS is exceptionally good at applying labels and titles in all sorts of ways that can, for very good reasons, I hasten to add, in many cases. So hierarchical labels, specialism labels, the departmental labels, they usually matter. Experience, as well as, of course, gender, age, ethnicity, some of those labels and titles that sometimes we hope don't affect how we listen up, but almost certainly do. So we need to kind of look at them. Now, advantage blindness is when we have lots of labels and titles in a system that conveys relative status and authority. So if we're a manager, for example, and perhaps white and maybe male, that doesn't always convey status, but in many systems it does. When we have labels and titles that convey status, we're sometimes the last person to notice how important those labels and titles are and the effect that they have on others. It's only when we don't have the labels and titles that help us, when we don't have them, we can kind of step back and go, oh, gosh, they make a real difference around here in terms of voice. So advantage blindness is when we don't realize that our experience isn't shared by others, when we don't realize that we actually need to do quite a bit more work than we thought to help people to feel at their ease. It's a trap that I fall into all the time. You know, if I'm giving a big presentation and I've got, you know, professor stamped on my forehead, I then wonder why people look a little tentative when I'm having a cup of coffee with them afterwards. And then I suddenly go, oh God, okay, right, I'm actually quite intimidating. I'm not, of course, I'm lovely, but they find me intimidating. That's advantage blindness. Okay. Second thing that I've uncovered in my research that means as a manager we stop listening or we don't do the work that we need to is called superiority illusion. So we've surveyed about 10,000 employees globally, and several thousand of those are healthcare professionals. And we asked, one of the questions we ask in the survey is, do those senior to you listen to you? Do they listen when you're talking about malpractice? Do they listen when you're speaking up with ideas or challenging ways of working? Or do they listen when you're looking at social and environmental issues? And these are the results that we get. So 80% of our respondents think that their boss usually or always listens if it's an issue of malpractice. Tends to be quite high in healthcare because obviously there's been a big focus on it. Less likely to listen if people are sort of challenging ways of working. But here's the thing, I then ask them to rate themselves at listening. And that's what happens. And I'm not sure I've ever had a situation with a team where this hasn't happened. So we rate ourselves on our intent to listen. And we rate other people on their behavior. And because I mean to listen, I want to listen, I kind of think that I'm quite good at listening. But I'm afraid to say if our teams, if those people reporting to us are asked about our listening skills, they're almost certainly not going to be as high as the way that we rate ourselves. And that's a shared issue. And it's an issue because, of course, I then don't think I need to work very hard because I'm listening already. So again, superiority illusion tends to mean that we don't do that extra bit of work that we need to help people be at their ease. So one area that this comes into my work just recently is I've done quite a lot of work in employee activism. So voices of difference in organisations speaking up about wider social and environmental issues. And we've identified a number of organisational and managerial responses to these voices of difference. Everything from kind of non-existent through to suppression, through to what we call facadism, which is when we say the right things, but there's no action at all. Defensive engagement, which is when we kind of engage, but only because we have to, and only the bare minimum. Through to what we might call more proactive engagement, dialogic engagement, listening, asking questions, sharing information, sharing decision-making, and even in some cases, stimulating activism, encouraging it, promoting it. Here's the thing, if you ask senior employees to rate their organization's response to activism, they're far more optimistic than junior employees. So a senior respondent is quite likely to say to me, yes, Megan, voices of difference, we're in dialogue. And then I'll go to the voice of difference and they'll go, no, we're not. That's not how I think we are. And so again, we call this part of the optimism bubble. As we get more senior, we overestimate our ability to listen. We overestimate our approachability. We underestimate the challenges very often that our employees are facing because they're not speaking up as much as we think they are. Okay, so how do we burst the bubble? A couple of things here I'll quickly whiz through. One obviously I'm going to give you a couple of slides here that are the classic practical tips, okay, because we all expect that in a webinar. We need practical tips. Hopefully in the question and answers, it'll become a bit more apparent that there's some fairly fundamental questions at the heart of listening. Actually, underneath all of this is, you know, do you really care? Do you want to listen? Is there a kind of compassion for self and others that is a foundation for listening? So there's some quite sort of fundamental questions behind these practical tips. But I do use the 5 W's framework, which is something that you may have heard of in other contexts. And it stands for who, why, what, where, and when. Who's, as a manager, some really useful questions. Whose voices aren't you hearing that you need to hear? And why? Why do you need to hear them? What's the benefit of seeing these other more silent voices? You know, what does that give you? And what body language and verbal language do you need to use to encourage those voices to speak? So you send signals all the time. Are those signals helping people to speak up? Or might they be kind of inadvertently silencing them? One classic one I was writing about this morning is the signal of busyness. You know, as a manager, when we're flying from one meeting to the other, you know, sending signals the whole time that basically are like, if you've got something to say, you've got about 1 minute, you'd better put it really, really articulately, and it's got to be important. You know, that we tend to be sort of sending those kind of signals quite a lot. And of course, that silences others. And they're where and when. You know, the environment matters. When do you ask people to speak up? Do you ask them in a Zoom meeting whether they've got any issues or feedback? Or is it kind of a one-to-one? You know, these decisions and choices matter, and they're worth making quite carefully. The other thing that I often refer to in my research, and I'll finish on this, is 3 traps that you may well have heard of, because I think they've done the rounds quite well in the NHS. But if you haven't heard them, here they are. One I've referred to already. You know, as managers, we forget how scary we are. We just published an article in Harvard Business Review called "Managers, You're More Intimidating Than You Think," even if you're lovely. I'm sure you're lovely, but in terms of other people, for their own reasons as well, they may find you quite intimidating. So how do you help them? Put them at their ease. How can you have that awareness? A second one is around what I call the little lists in our head about the people that we go to and seek opinions from, and the list of people that we don't hear from. And this is about questioning the lists. A lot of us, again, according to our research, a lot of us go to the same people for opinions and advice. Now, does that list of go-to people look a lot like you? And who's on this list, and why are they on that list, and what's the consequences of that? So just questioning that list, and of course, that's the territory of unconscious bias, and being able to approach that and talk about that in workplace systems. Really, really important. And final one, touched on this just briefly, are the signals that we send. I talk about sending shut up signals rather than speak up signals. We send them all the time. The one I often talk about to a lot of wry smiles is what is politely and optimistically called the thinking face, which is when you do that when somebody's speaking, which I do all the time, and I notice on Zoom and or Teams, and then I look awful, I look really scary, but I'm really thinking, I'm just thinking. So we send signals when we're doing our emails on Teams, yeah, and thinking that we can do that subtly. Can't, it's never subtle. Honestly, it's never subtle. So signals mean that people are either tempted to speak up or tempted to stay silent. So how can we know our faces? How can we know the signals that we're sending? And particularly when people do speak up, gosh, you know, when they might not do it well, yeah, but they might have taken quite a lot of bravery to speak up. Your response in that next moment will determine whether they speak up again and whether their colleagues do. So looking out for those traps is a really, really important awareness practice, I think, for managers. So just in summary from 8 years of research, speaking up and listening up matter. You know that. Our habits have consequences. We blame other people for not speaking up. We try and fix them. And actually, we need to be looking at ourselves and our systems and why people have to be so brave to speak up in the first place. I'm afraid we're not as good as we think we are. And the more senior you become, the more you get into one of those lovely little bubbles. And if you're not careful, that doesn't get burst. And you don't even realize that you're disconnected from what's going on the ground. So anything to do with inclusion and changing culture, in fact, anything to do with developing yourself as a manager, probably requires you to change what gets said or who gets heard. Just some resources to go to if you wanted to go to. There's a recent research report on activism, employee activism, the Speak Up book. My website's got lots and lots of resources, and we did do an article quite a while back now in BMJ Leader looking specifically at UK healthcare that you might want to look up to. With that, and roundabout on time, I'm going to hand back to you, Jon, and in fact also to David, I think.
Thank you, Megan. That was superb. I think if there's a little bell in anyone's head where every time you see something you recognise it rang a lot as you were going through your slides. And I think, huge amounts of anecdotal evidence in my head to support all of the things that you've just talked about, certainly in the healthcare context. So Megan referred to a few articles and blogs. Catherine's very helpfully put those into the chat box, so you can follow up. I'll certainly be reading those myself. If there are any questions or observations, then let us have them. David, before we go into general conversation, you were going to give us some sort of learnings from a career in both management and latterly in the freedom to speak up field. So over to you, and then I'll bring us all together for a chat.
Thank you, Jon. It was a real pleasure to hear what Megan had to say and how infectious are you. You will need to do more of it, and certainly the learning from what you said correlates with my experience of well over 40 years, both as a former chief exec, which is a while back now. It's actually 15 years, but I had a period of 17 years when I held very senior appointments. On behalf of chief execs, and there are members of our trade union who are actively involved in these conversations, they have a really impossible job, don't they? The majority of them don't last. The tenure is 2 to 3 years. With a few notable exceptions, more or less, you're looking to manage your exit before you've managed your induction. I mean, that's the craziness of all this. It's got better, but it's becoming more political. And over a long career, there was often said you have to manage down and you have to manage up. And one of my weaknesses was managing up, because I didn't really see the point of it. But it became important to my career when I wasn't actually spending enough time telling my bosses at regional and national level all the things that we were about. And of course, over a period of time, I think I've counted 7 or 8 reorganisations. The deck chairs move. The issues rarely change, but there are some consistent points. As a chief executive and on all senior managers, you're relatively isolated. I fit a lot of the profile, certainly when I was a younger manager that you described. I had all the faults that you've referred to, and it took quite a long time to recognise them, to face them up, and then to make some modifications. And I think my career ended before I managed to get there. Yeah. But I do feel that with the proper encouragement, people can pick up the good traits. I coined a phrase that small voices make loud noises, and it's the staff on the ground. I remember as a board member in Liverpool once visiting a ward at Broad Green Hospital, actually, and we wandered on with the non-exec members, and one of the staff nurses said, "What is a non-executive director?" And I think 20 seconds later, she got bored with my reaction and basically said, I'm busy, I'll need to leave you with it. Just if you need anything, shout. And it reminded me of how insignificant, really, to the world of her world we were. Organisations are massive. I mean, Manchester Foundation Trust, where I was involved as Freedom to Speak Up Governor, and it's great that Karen, the new Speaking Up Governor, and Joe are online today. 26,000 staff. You know, we have 30 local champions. And if they can pick up little gems, the chief exec of that organisation and the board genuinely want to know if there are issues. Now, I'll speak for a moment about speaking up, but just in terms of the pressures that the NHS is under, you know, there's a safety valve there, and I think speaking up is a really important channel so that things do not boil over, literally. And I think it's important and it should be nurtured and developed further. A few words about speaking up, John, and then I'm really keen that we open up to the group so we can have the chat. In my couple of years, 2.5 years, I think, I looked after the speaking up function and was accessible to staff. There were three categories. There was clinical concerns around patient safety, things where staff, it might be to do with you know, the way that patients are moved between wards and departments. It might be between off duties. It can be all sorts of things. There are issues around how staff are treated, how they feel not necessarily nurtured and developed as individuals. And then there's this word bullying, which I noticed you didn't use in your presentation, Megan. And it maybe it's a little bit of an old, but it's there. And staff, the NHS has got a whole load of powerful tribes, whether they're medical, nursing, managerial. And you know, you do as you're seen to do. And the worry of retribution, the worry of what will happen, who will look out for me, not for the positives, but for the negative if these concerns aren't. So the confidentiality is so important. But I'm clearly a big fan of the speaking up arrangements, and I feel that MIP and partner organisations want it to flourish. Never before have we needed to have a voice for staff, whether it's through their trade unions, but I think professionally this is so important. And finally, I would say with some optimism that the NHS is still, and I was hearing on the radio this morning that although we all cheered at 8 o'clock a few months ago during COVID, we should continue to cheer and support our staff, raise morale, say that they're not there for themselves, they're there for our NHS community. I think all these initiatives. So thank you for inviting me to the session. And if I can help with the conversations going forward, I will do in the chat box. Thank you, John. Thanks, Megan.
Brilliant. You are two of the most timely presenters I've worked with in a long time. So we're just a minute ahead of schedule now, thanks to your skill. I haven't seen any questions unless I'm missing them. So I'm going to start with a question to you both, actually. And David, you touched on it, but I'm sure Megan can offer perspective as well. And that is the environment in which everyone's working. So, you know, clearly healthcare at the best of times is a very high pressure environment, more so in some parts than others. And when pressure is on, people's behaviour changes and it's harder to maintain the best standards of behaviour that you might want to see. And I was really struck when we did a piece of work on bullying in the health service. Well, we were talking a lot about management behaviour and behaviours and codes and the rest of it, but actually all the researchers kept going back. You'll see bullying spike where pressure is highest. You'll see bullying spike where, you know, the demand on the services is highest. I just wondered, is there any, in your view, starting with you, Megan, a relationship between that broader context of pressure and the ability or otherwise of managers to listen up effectively? Do do they become affected by that broader context? And if so, is there a lesson for us there in how we manage listening up in what could be 2 or 3 years of really intense pressure on services? I'll start with you, Megan, and then I'll come to you, David.
Yes, of course there is a relationship. That it's funny because some of you may know that a lot of my other research is also in mindfulness meditation practices and how we train the mind and how and whether that links to leadership practice. So a lot of that was going through my head when I was listening to you speak. Theoretically, you know, we have a choice about the external environment, and as long as we are able to be aware of how the external environment is affecting us and have just that space in our mind where we have the awareness and the curiosity to go, okay, I can see what's about to happen here, then you've got a choice in how you respond, and you can actually listen up very well indeed. But that's a tall order, that's a big ask. So I think in reality, for many of us, you know, under a pressured kind of system, we tend to cut out some of the things that we think in the moment are optional. So we cut out the kind of having a cup of tea with a friend. We cut out some of the conversation that asks people how they are, or if we don't cut them out, we say it in a way where it's really clear that we don't expect an answer. You know, how are you doing? So we cut out the kind of bits around the side, and just maybe David was talking about small voices. We've also got a phrase in our research that says the big conversations rely on the small conversations happening. So you don't get people raising issues about malpractice or offering ideas, or you don't get people reaching out to care for others and speaking up with those sorts of comments, unless you've sort of built an environment where there is that level of care and respect and awareness in the team. Now, you know, obviously there's a catch-22. When you're so busy, you don't spend the time necessary on those conversations. So ideally, we build that before we're in a situation where it's really, really put under pressure. So yes, of course, there is a pattern between our external environment and what happens then to our conversations. And ironically, it's when we're under pressure that we most need people to speak and listen. So, you know, as managers, when we're pulled from above so much, and we're probably not necessarily getting a role model experience from our leaders, you know, they've not stopped and suddenly become very good listeners necessarily. It is a big ask, but it is a real management ask to create, first of all, the awareness of the impact and the signals that you're passing on to your team, and then if feasible, create those spaces for those sorts of conversations which may not feel important in the moment, but my goodness, they are. So I'll pause there and listen to what David also has to say on that.
I'd say just briefly that, you know, looking and reflecting on that challenge, a lot of management is about theatre, and I don't mean the operating theatre. So people behave in a standard way, particularly when we're working against deadlines, performance targets. There are tipping points, there are elephant traps. There's a, you know, there's a real need to remind ourselves there's no I in teams. And also, where is the system wisdom? Where is the give? Where do we give relief? Managers can't be wholly brilliant at everything. You know, and on a clinical basis, particularly, I mean, I've, you know, had different titles, administrator, general manager, you know, all of those things. But actually, I always felt, and it's probably important to feel, that if you're not hands-on clinical, you're part of the support class. Now, a lot of my senior colleagues would say, hang on a minute, we're sort of, we might not be professors, but at the end of the day, the key action is in clinic. It's on the wards and departments. And if we don't get that right, the rest of it's irrelevant. So I do think it's important to keep pushing the message into the system that those voices need to be heard. And sometimes, and yes, people make mistakes. I remember the medical director in Liverpool, it was Professor Sir Ian Gilmore, actually, who became president of Royal College, asking them when we would have the junior doctor rotation, reminding them that they would all make prescribing errors and asking roughly how many prescribing errors in a year there would be. There were 40,000 errors, most of which weren't serious, of course, but, just many. When you have something, do not hide away. And this point about hiding away becomes a feature in a bad culture. There needs to be an opportunity to share with a colleague, probably a more experienced. And I'll just say this, that whether you're a nurse, a doctor, or an administrator, you're in a cul-de-sac. If you've not got anybody who's there looking over your shoulder, mentoring you, giving you a little bit of difficult time. I mean, sometimes you have to be reminded how you behave if you're not behaving well. And that can come better from somebody who supports you rather than somebody who's looking to undermine you. So I'll just offer you those thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm conscious of something that Megan said about people appearing more intimidating than they feel. And I wonder if we as a panel have done that trick with our participants. So please do not be shy about making your points and asking your questions. Megan, I was really struck by the slide you had showing where people are likely to speak up and on what issues, and that whole idea, which is the mantra of so many at the moment, of bringing yourself to work. And there's a huge crossover with inclusive management styles that you've described. Is there a connection between how willing people are to raise sort of compliance concerns with the overall willingness of the organisation to listen to them on all of those other factors, like their social and wider concerns and their ideas about how the work can be done? Are these things related? Are they in a relationship, or are people sort of duty bound on the malpractice stuff but less so on the others? And can we get more raising of concerns on quality if we're more prepared to listen to people on Black Lives Matter or some other aspect of their identity? Just tell us a bit more about that, because I was fascinated by that.
It's a really good question, and it's research that we're working on at the moment to see the connections there. I mean, my kind of obvious anecdotal but not yet backed up with figures response is that the more people feel included and that they belong in a community, the more likely they are to speak up. The less likely they are to perceive that they will face negative consequences as a result of speaking up. So it would sound very likely to me that the more you are able to have these wider sort of conversations, the more likely it is that people will also feel okay and included and belonging enough to speak up about other issues. We do find that in kind of compliance heavy industries, so particularly in healthcare and in banking, you can have a situation where the speaking up around malpractice is quite high, relatively speaking, because there's so many processes and procedures and duties of candor and various other things in place that there's an expectation that you speak up, and actually it's quite low on other things. So it is a little bit of a complex relationship. So I always talk about, when we talk about having speak up cultures, we need to get under the skin of that. It's like, well, speak up about what and why, and because and you can't tend to just say, is a culture high on speaking up? It's like it can be high in certain things, but not in others. So it's always a good question for that particular team to say, when we do speak up, what do we speak up about, and what isn't on the agenda yet, and does that matter? Does that have consequences?
Brilliant. So we have some questions, which is excellent. And I think it does play to the one where you both touched on this need for really highly pressured teams to actually come together and talk and reflect and listen to each other. And not only is that difficult when, you know, it's all hands to the pump, but we've now got a new environment of online working, which a lot of clinical teams as well as other teams are experiencing. It does feel harder, says one person here, to create those comfortable spaces in the online world. And I just wondered how you might go about sort of overcoming that. It does feel to me like a real issue, actually. You're missing a lot by not being in the room with people. Not always popular for the people who are very wedded to home working to hear, but there does seem to be a point there about how you can foster listening cultures in a digital environment. Some people, of course, have never met the people they're managing. They've been appointed in the last 18 months and they're continuing. So any reflections on that and how people might overcome that? David, do you want to?
I'm happy to begin an answer. I think it's about balance. I mean, you know, if you can't smell the coffee, literally, you're just taking a version of events and this virtual world that we're all in here. I mean, it's one that I don't prefer. I much prefer to be in the environment of healthcare with teams, but there is a place for this and it does help shortcut certain things, but it's not the answer. There's got to be the blend, back to the coffee. There's got to be the blend of the virtual plus the physical, but you need to, and I know in this COVID world, I nearly use the word hug your friends, but you do need that physicality. You do need that being around when you hear the sounds, you hear the bell, you know, you hear all that and the pressure builds. And I think that's not necessarily a trauma situation, but it's actually even in the offices. I mean, look at the hard pressed colleagues in procurement and what they've been through. This is for another webinar, John, but looking at what they might face by way of probing questions about PPE. So whichever part of it, but the question about comfortable spaces, I think managers should ensure it's not an exclusive method, but it's fitted a part of a range of other communications, you know, and that's my answer for now. But I mean, Megan and the academics were probably looking at the deep research into this because there can be damage. Having never physically met your boss, who was a point, it would worry me. I think you just need to have the opportunities, and if you can't, create them. And then I'm picking up Joe Wilkinson's question around about engaging staff. There can be some non-work situations. I mean, we just had in Manchester our 10K, and there were hundreds of staff doing the exercise together. You know, you can do a lot when you giggle with somebody that you work with. You may not always agree, but I think if you can get that emotional intelligence and build the opportunities to know a little bit about the person behind the badge, for me, that's important. Thank you.
Very good. And I think there is, I suppose, the counter to this idea of, you know, it being difficult online is that some digital communication has actually reduced senses of isolation. It's actually improved the quality and frequency of communication between often dispersed groups. So sometimes that, you know, that nothing is a yes or no kind of situation, is it? Megan, on either the point around the online world we now inhabit more, or how do you really get into engaging staff? What would you recommend? What thoughts would you offer?
Well, just building on what you just said there, John. What I found, I mean, I haven't had a particular project looking at virtual, but we've had lots of anecdotal information and research, which it suggests it depends on the person, how they've experienced virtual working. You know, some people are delighted with it and feel that there's less power distance than there is when you're physically present, for whatever reason that might be, and have felt that they'd be more able to speak up, and in some cases more able to listen over the virtual platforms. Other people are, you know, really definitely that, you know, the lack of physicality and the physical cues is a real a real challenge. So I think what it means for managers is making sure that you inquire with your teams. How have the individuals been experiencing virtual working? If they're going to continue to experience it, what have they learned? What have you learned about what helps that platform to work? What doesn't help it? And, you know, some things that don't normally help is when you're in virtual meetings that are back to back, a bit like physical meetings, and you get people coming in late, clearly with their heads still in the meeting that they've just been to, rushed into a short amount of time, and then they're off to the next virtual meeting without moving, you know. And it, again, linking perhaps back a bit to the mindfulness research, is one thing that we do with teams, physical and virtual, is just in the first couple of minutes of a meeting, spending time landing and just becoming present and noticing where our head is and noticing our intent for this particular meeting. You know, we're not doing it, and my research would suggest that just a couple of minutes at the beginning of meetings that does that work makes a huge difference for how we show up with one another, for how we relate to one another, let alone the amount that we then cover and the good ideas that are mentioned. So I think whether we're virtual or physical, there is a real question about how are we showing up, and finding out what individual experiences are and what we've been learning over the last year and a half. So maybe I'll pause there, Jon.
A really strong point, and I think certainly one of the Zoomification of work is definitely coming at a price, even where people can see lots of advantages to it, simply because of that every available space is now taken up with a call. We've got a few minutes left. I just wanted to touch on something that one of the participants, actually the second time round, so very productive participant here, raising the question. I think this is true coming from what we talked about, very much about leaders becoming better at listening up and giving the wider organisation permission. This point is more about how do we get more to a bottom-up scenario where, you know, if you like, staff at all levels want to be involved and encourage each other to raise concerns and so on. Is there something in that? Is it too much of a top-down sort of organisational movement at the moment? Could it be something else? I want, David, you've sort of straddled freedom, speak up and management. Do you want to give us a quick response to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think nothing can be exclusive, can it? I think got to be channels, different levels of communication. You know, there are certain things that can be discussed over time and matured like a good wine. There are certain things that have to be dealt with now, today, and it could be that I'm on my own, I'm a junior doctor, and you know, and this Denise's point there about listening up, it should be part of the whole scene, but it's about how those teams develop in their particular areas. You know, you feel very much bonded to the group that you work with. And I think that interrelationship between one department and another, whether you're in a laboratory, on a ward or a department, you know, that need to think there's somebody else in the lineup here beside myself, I think is important, as Denise has said, that we do drive that change from the bottom and bring up that opportunity to be good comrades, to be good support. I think there's also, with the speaking up, listening up, a need to channel, to almost get that channel right, so that things that are urgent, I mean, nobody wants to see, you know, fatalities or, you know, mistakes. What do we call it nowadays? You know, the errors that are very unique. You know, never events. That's the word I'm looking for. We don't want that, do we? Never events. What we need is a consistently good, always professional NHS. Thank you.
Megan, did you sort of see something in what that question was aimed at? As sort of, have we overprivileged like leadership as the answer to all of these issues?
Yeah, yes and no. The leadership plays a hugely important role in culture development in an organisation. You know, I did go through a phase in my work where I kind of quite like to think that actually, no, it's fine, we can get stuck in wherever. And time again, I come across situations where leaders role modeling or managers role modeling or lack of it is a hell of a thing in an organization. So it is tricky when all the pressures from above are countering speaking up and listening up. It's hard, but not impossible, to create your own culture within your team as a manager. So I have definitely worked with managers that are in the midst of toxic environments who, through very skillful kind of support and boundary making, enable their team pretty much to speak up and listen up to one another, despite kind of what's going on. What I like to think is, you know, we can, so I do a lot of work at senior level because I do see how important it is. But also in your question, you know, I was thinking of work which, you know, Bridget Russell, Charlie Jones, some of you might be familiar of their spaces for listening work. It is possible to do all sorts of fantastic listening work in organizations that does not depend on it being mandated from above and can go on regardless. And so I'm extremely supportive of that as well. So leadership matters hugely, but it isn't the be all and end all, I would say.
Brilliant. Right, we have 4 minutes. We have crammed a huge amount into an hour, which shows you the power of an hour. And I've learned a lot, and there's plenty of threads to pull. I just wanted to take you both back to, Megan touched on the optimism bubble and how you can be both blind to your own advantage and have that sort of illusion about your own superiority what's one practical step you could take to start yourself on a journey of bursting that bubble? Megan, what would be your top tip for a manager who's in desperate need of a bubble burst?
Do you know what? I increasingly think that managers and leaders actually know how they want to show up at work. They know that listening is important and they know how to listen. Yeah, we spend a huge amount of time training them. And actually what we need to do ourselves is create some space where we can just remember that we want to listen and that we know how to listen. You know, increasingly, I just think actually it's not so much about telling people, it's about creating spaces in our workplaces and in our lives as a manager and as an organization whereby people can kind of go, right, this is how I want to be. This is how I want to show up today. And I've had a tiny little space in my mind or in my workplace where I've remembered that. That's what I'd say.
Brilliant. Thank you. David, about 30 seconds.
My reflection is we're all unique. I remember, and I was picking up on Megan's point, how do we show up affects our voices. I've worked for people in the past when they've spoken to me, I couldn't speak. I was thinking in bubbles. The words were not emerging because I was so concerned that I'd get it wrong, they wouldn't understand it. So I think one of the things for me is to celebrate your uniqueness. Celebrate, be confident in what you are and what you can be. And finally, you know, be brave. You know, what's the worst thing that can happen? You know, if it's for the patients or it's for your colleagues, you can be, you will feel better when you've got it off your chest, so to speak. So get it off your chest.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, look, we're now hard up against time, and I just want to thank Megan Reitz and David Cain for joining me for what has been a really interesting and I hope inspiring hour. Plenty of threads to pull, so we've put some of the materials into the chat bar, and I know obviously through the National Guardian's Office there's training online and otherwise for managers in particularly around Listen Up. So pull all of those threads, create the space for yourself, and get things off your chest is the closing message from our panel. So thank you very, very much for joining us, and hope to see you at future events at some point soon. Okay, bye now, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.